It is indeed hard to get bored if you are studying the history of the British Isles. Wars, raids, and occasional invasions always make good stories. Like the one we are gonna talk about today, the Norman Conquest of England, which is a 5-star historical blockbuster about how a couple of French-speaking Vikings want to take England from the hands of their arch-enemies, the Saxons. This is some Game of Thrones level stuff, so come around and listen up. It all goes way back to the 10th century, when the king of West Francia found a super smart way to deal with Viking raiders pillaging through his land. Vikings were in it mostly for the money and fertile lands, right? So the king came up with a brilliant idea. He gave some of the Vikings some land up north, so that they would settle up there and fight those who wanted to attack inland France. Rollo the Viking was baptized a Christian, and thus the Duchy of Normandy, one of the greatest regional administrations of medieval France, was established. Normandy became a place of cultural mixture for the Scandinavians and the local Gallo-Frankish population. The Dukes of Normandy adopted Frankish as their language and became staunch warriors and defenders of the Catholic faith. Starting from 1035, William became the Duke of Normandy. He was a bastard, but was also a direct descendant of Rollo. His illegitimate status made things very hard for him, and it took him a long time to establish himself as the undisputed ruler of Normandy. If you are someone who is interested in medieval history, you probably know by this point that medieval bloodlines and kinships are quite complicated. It was possible for the nobility to have claim on titles and lands through marriages and relatives. Such was the case for William of Normandy. Ethelred the Unready, the King of England, had married the sister of a previous Duke of Normandy. Their son, Edward the Confessor, succeeded the English throne after spending a lot of time in exile in Normandy. Edward's eventual ascension to the throne paved the way for a strong Norman claim on the English throne. Indeed, Edward was a friend of the Normans. He appointed many Normans to positions of power during his reign and relied heavily on Norman support for the conflict he had with Harold Godwinson, one of the most powerful nobles in his lands. Edward the Confessor died without an heir. The Council of Wise Men, the Witan, elected Harold Godwinson as the new King of England. His reign was not going to be smooth and easy. Two very powerful figures had a claim on his throne and did not believe in the legitimacy of his rule. Also, he had a brother, Tostig, who really didn't like him. There was King Harald Hardrade of Norway. He had a claim on the English throne through some agreements his predecessor, Magnus the Good, made with the English king, Canute III. Harold Godwinson's second enemy was William of Normandy. He claimed that Harold was an usurper and did not have rightful claim on the English throne. He accused him of using his power to influence his way up to the English throne. So began the fight against Harold Godwinson, the last king of Saxon England. This is England. When it rains, it pours. Tostig, the exiled brother, started raiding South England. He was not very successful, but soon after that, he joined his forces with Harald Hardrade of Norway, who had initiated his invasion. They defeated the armies of Earls of Mercia and Northumbria and invaded northern England. Their advance down south was interrupted by King Harold Godwinson. The King of England successfully scattered the enemy army and emerged victorious. Yet his own forces also suffered heavy losses, and this certainly did not encourage him, considering that he still had to deal with the Duke of Normandy. William levied and recruited troops from different nations, gathered an army, organized a fleet, and eventually initiated his invasion. After dealing with Harold's fleet, they landed on southern England. One thing to notice about Normans is that they were not all about muscles. They were fierce fighters, indeed, but they also developed complex tactics to bend the flow of war to their advantage. They set up a wooden fort near Hastings and used this fort as a base of operations for their raids. These raids provided the Normans with extra supplies and made Harold hurry. Harold tried to surprise the Normans, but Normans had scouts who had noticed the march of Harold's forces. Harold took defensive positions on a hill. He had the upper hand in terms of terrain, yet his army was not diverse enough compared to William's army, which presented a mixture of archers, foot soldiers, and cavalry. This gave William a tactical advantage. However, the ironclad wheel of the English soldiers who had formed a shield wall was able to inflict heavy casualties on William's army. This caused some of the Bretons in William's army to flee. Some Saxon soldiers started chasing William's Bretons, but were run down by the hefty charge of Norman cavalry. Maybe Normans already had this in mind, and maybe they didn't. But at some point, they realized that making Saxon troops chase them, and then run over the dispositioned Saxons with cavalry was a good idea. They faked their withdrawal 2 or 3 times, and were able to overcome Saxons' defensive advantage, which stemmed from their initial high starting ground. The fighting was heavy for both sides. At some point, rumor of William's death spread among Norman soldiers. Yet, William sprang forth and rallied his troops. After several hours, Normans gained the upper hand. Harold Godwinson died on the battlefield. William was victorious. It took several years for William to establish himself as the King of England. He met resistance. The Saxons were not keen on giving up the islands their ancestors fought so valiantly to protect. Yet, William's iron fist crushed most of these rebellions. Through a mixture of sophisticated, organized administration and intense violence, William was able to gain some resemblance of kingly authority over England. Thus began a new era. Norman rule introduced many elements to England, some of which remain intact to this day. First of all, they built castles around the country to be able to keep rebellions under control by strengthening their rule. The Normans were not very happy with Saxon English nobles having regional authority. They replaced a significant amount of nobility with nobles of their own liking. Normans did not completely dismiss the old English institutions, but rather they made some adjustments. This meant a change for regional administrations, some of which were centuries old. The branches of the Catholic Church in England were no exception, and they too were heavily altered by the new appointments made by the Normans. The Normans had taken the country by force, received the support and approval of several European powers and the Papal State, and were now bending the country towards their will. The age of Anglo-Saxons was over in England. Saxons started migrating to different regions of the world, with some going to the Byzantine Empire, which were in dire need of fighters due to its constant wars and strife. Another great change occurred in terms of language. The English nobility had been mostly using Old English for daily and administrative purposes. With the establishment of Norman rule, Latin became the predominant administrative language. Anglo-Norman, a mixture of a dialect of Old French with some Scandinavian influences and some influences from Old English, became the colloquial language of the nobility and the people. And in a relatively short time, this mixed language started producing its own literature. This change in language is also the reason why the modern English we use today has many French words in it. William and the Normans were seen as tyrants by some and as heroes and saviors by others. With so many different accounts on them, it is hard to tell which was true. Yet, it is certain that the bastard duke, who eventually became a conqueror and a king, had a lasting effect on the course of history.